Hello, and welcome to Mesa Refuge. I'm Elaine Ellenson, and I'm the president of the board of Mesa Refuge. And on behalf of our board and our staff, I want to welcome you today to our program, Georgia on My Mind, the New Fight for Voting Rights. This program is part of our online series called From the Gathering Room, where our Mesa Refuge alums have supported us by presenting their work in readings, discussions, and workshops. And during the pandemic, this has allowed us to stay in touch with our far-flung community and to welcome new people to Mesa Refuge. I want to share a few logistical details before I introduce Dr. Robert Franklin and Brenda Payton Jones, our wonderful alums and our guests for today's program. Georgia on My Mind, the New Fight for Voting Rights. Mesa Refuge is a writing residency on the edge, literally on the edge. We are perched on a bluff above Tamales Bay, and we have the mission of supporting writers who focus on the environment, economic equity, and social justice. Today's program is part of our Changemakers fundraising campaign. Each year, Mesa highlights a few of our alums whose work focuses on the issues that we care about, and our change makers have joined us to share their wisdom and activism with the world. This campaign helps us to provide time and space to writers at no cost to themselves. I'm very excited today that we have two of our talented alums, Dr. Robert Franklin and journalist Brenda Payton Jones, to discuss an urgent issue, the virulent and widespread attempt to suppress voting rights in our country. This is no less than an assault on our democracy, and it is aimed directly at African American voters and other voters of color. During the last election, Georgia was the epicenter of this fight, and I know that many of you wrote postcards and made phone calls and donated funds to support voting rights there. But it is a fight taking place all over this country now. According to the Brennan Center, there are currently 361 laws proposing restrictions on voting rights in 47 states. Some are pending and are being opposed by a broad coalition, and others have passed and are being challenged by a flying squad of volunteer lawyers. The fight back is strong. Here to talk about this is someone who has been at the center of this fight to protect voting rights for many decades, Dr. Robert Franklin. Robert is the president-emeritus of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, that is Dr. Martin Luther King's alma mater, and a professor at Emory University. He is the author of 4 books, including his recently released Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, Imagination, published just last year, which he worked on at Mesa Refuge. Dr. Franklin will be interviewed by one of the Bay Area's top journalists, Brenda Payton Jones. Brenda wrote a thrice weekly column for the Oakland Tribune for 26 years, many of which focused on racial justice. She co-produced Your Loan is Denied, a documentary on lending discrimination that aired on PBS's Frontline, taught journalism at San Francisco State University, and was the coordinator of the Maynard Institute's Oakland Voices program. So now I would like to turn the mic over to Brenda and Robert. Welcome.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining this really important conversation. And I'll start with, I guess, some of your own personal history. How did you first get involved with the fight to protect voting rights?
Well, thank you, Brenda. It's a real honor to be with you. I'm a big fan of your writing and your thoughts over the years and from a distance. I did have the great honor of living in the Bay Area during a sabbatical in 2013, a fateful year when it comes to Supreme Court action on the Shelby case. It has some bearing on this conversation today, but I was there at Stanford University's Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Center. And so followed some of the currents in that part of California, and inspired by the many democracy promoting advocates throughout California and certainly in the Bay Area. So I was, again, inspired there. At Morehouse College, I was a political science major and thought I would go on to law school. I did not, and consequently ended up in seminary studying ethics, and then later returned to my hometown in Chicago, the University of Chicago, to pursue courses in social ethics and earned a PhD there. Hence, my interest in moral leadership for the common good, leadership of integrity, of courage, of imagination, wisdom, and empathy that seeks to advance the best interests of the common good and the general welfare. So that's really my persistent interest. But I will say that as a student at Morehouse during the early 70s, I worked on campaigns and helped to elect Maynard Jackson as Atlanta's first African-American mayor. I worked on Andrew Young's campaign when he was elected to the U.S. Congress. And then also had the privilege of working closely with the state senator, Julian Bond, as a senior student and intern. So I've had an abiding interest in politics, the relationship between politics and ethics. Those, of course, two books written by Aristotle. And so I've always had that more philosophical interest as well as a practical interest. And then I'll just end with this. As president of Morehouse College, had the privilege of helping to educate and inspire thousands of young people, young men in the case of Morehouse, and then across the street at Spelman, young women, inspiring them all to become more civically engaged and to become globalists. So there's an international component to why I'm interested in politics. And then finally, in July of 2020, last year, when our beloved John Lewis passed away, I declared my candidacy to complete the unexpired term of John Lewis in Congress, and had a remarkable experience. We can talk more about that if you wish to, but it was such a privilege to do that. In part, a kind of honor to John Lewis, an honor to the fact that Lewis was not simply a politician, more than a transactional politician, to be sure, but was also a transformational leader and a public moralist, a public intellectual. And so we can talk more about that. But that has pressed on me since then. And now I am happy to support dear friends here in the Georgia area like Stacey Abrams and like Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, who are both close friends. They're on the front lines in an incredible way, and I continue to try to support them in all that they do.
Very interesting. So is it fair to say that you were involved intimately, I guess, in the Get Out the Vote campaign in Georgia most recently?
Yes, I was, and I experienced, Brenda, the highs and lows of voting in Georgia. So some of you who viewed the daily or evening news saw those remarkably long lines in June of 2020. I stood in one of those lines, and later I provided water and refreshments to people in those lines. So we can talk about that once we get into some of the critical elements of the bill itself. And so I was involved, and then worked especially hard to be elected myself to honor John Lewis, but then later working to help elect John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. We were thrilled with what occurred on January 5th in this country.
So, and what were some of the key elements of that campaign?
Yeah, you mean their campaign, the Senate campaign, or my own run?
I guess the Senate campaign.
I think that's the really critical one, because that has really been a pivotal moment for our nation, and I think has helped to move, as Dr. King used to talk about, the arc of the moral universe, move it closer toward justice. As these two Democrats were elected, and I don't want to become exceedingly partisan in this conversation. I really do think we need more and more citizens to be concerned with the common good and the well-being of our democracy. And although we may wear and have our partisan loyalties, we also have other loyalties. I love the way Stacey Abrams talks about this, particularly, that we wear two hats, all of us. Our particular interests in a particular set of policy recommendations and candidates' victories, but also our concern for the good of the nation, the good of our democracy. And at times we may act in ways that really advance the best interests of the democracy over our own personal self-interest. I think the critical thing was holding Donald Trump and the far-right extremist Republicans accountable, particularly for their ethical violations and for the various and sundry political moves being made to institutionalize long-term partisan gerrymandering, voter suppression, and discouraging and intimidating Black and brown voters through various measures. And so someone needed to intervene and say, hey, you crossed the line here. This is discouraging people from voting. And so that was critical. And I think that's why the people of this state mobilized in a significant way. And it was really inspiring because it was a multiracial, interfaith, cross-class kind of mobilization and coalition of conscience that won those victories, and I think will continue to win as we go forward throughout the nation.
So I've read that during that campaign, there was a successful effort to reach rural residents who had been often neglected or overlooked. Yeah. And I'm wondering why you thought they were overlooked and what were some of the new strategies to reach them?
Yeah, I think that, all of us who reside in metro areas and in cities have to be careful about how we tilt systems and make them convenient for urban dwellers and people who may be exceedingly mobile and forget about those who reside in rural areas. And so, for instance, there were many counties that had not used drop boxes before, for instance, that really emerged in the wake of the pandemic. And some of the voter education and orientation that had not occurred was starting to occur, and people were beginning to have a broader conversation. So I'm really pleased to see the kind of learning that was happening in terms of outreach. And certainly in the case of the senatorial candidates, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, moving throughout the state, identifying the economic interests of people throughout the state, finding areas of common ground and common concern for job creation, for economic well-being, for protecting their right to vote, their access to voting, to vote safely during the pandemic, hence drop boxes and absentee ballots and other measures that were put in place. And so I really celebrate the learning on our feet that occurred during those times. And for all of you who played your own roles in encouraging this change and this progressive move forward in Georgia. We were so often the poster child for bad political behavior, for voter suppression especially. And it's remarkable to have the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia say, we have managed to conduct elections in which there's been unprecedented outpouring of voters, increased numbers, and again, but thanks in so much measure to Stacey Abrams and other grassroots leaders, but other nonprofit organizations and national organizations that encourage that. On one hand, increased voter participation, registration, et cetera. And on the other hand, in terms of the back office activities of counting votes, recounting votes, ensuring the integrity of votes, and ensuring that there was relatively little, fraudulent behavior is remarkable. And the Republican Secretary of State testified to that. And so we will always remember that remarkable conversation. The President of the United States called the Secretary of State, his fellow party members. It's like the general of the military calling a sergeant saying, look, this is what I want to see happen. And that's a remarkable amount of pressure. And for that sergeant, that Secretary of State, to say, no, sir, you're wrong. Your facts are wrong. There was no such fraudulent behavior. And this was a remarkably clean, honest election where votes were counted properly and people can have confidence in the outcome. And to hear the President of the United States, walk away and just live it, and continuing to attack the governor of the state and others for not doing more to essentially misrepresent the results and to steal the election. So even again, my interest in moral leadership, people who speak truth to power, as Elie Wiesel defines moral leadership, people who do the right thing, even when it's not in their own partisan best interest. But the loyalty and primary commitment is to the health and hygiene of the democracy. I think in that instance, the Secretary of State did that, and I commend him. There are other actions that I will take issue with him on, but I do want to call out and celebrate moral leadership and agency when I see it.
And were you surprised that they stood up to Trump?
I was, because so many powerful leaders in that party were buckling under the pressure. He was a remarkable manipulator throughout that period. And leaders like the Secretary of State here, the Director of the Elections, even the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, came out and acknowledged that this party is moving in the wrong direction. We should be reaching out to new voters, trying to craft policy positions and messages that appeal to a more diverse demographic in Georgia. Instead, we're doubling down on messages that are rooted in fear, in grievance, in paranoia, in xenophobia. And so, again, I do commend that there are leaders in the Republican Party who were stepping up. And I was surprised, Brenda, that they did so, because they did so at great risk. And of course, we know that many of those leaders will be primaried by Trump Republicans. And so we'll see how that plays itself out. But we know from the life of Martin King and Jimmy Carter and Abraham Lincoln and Ella Baker and Dolores Huerta and so many moral leaders on the scene, and of course, Nelson Mandela, that a price is often paid for integrity and for courage. So I commend them, but I think we all have to stand with those leaders in those moments as well.
Mm. So in Elaine's words, Georgia has become the epicenter for voting rights, both illustrating the possibilities of getting out the vote and reaching new voters, and in developing some of the most extreme voter suppression efforts. Why Georgia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that certainly because Georgia became the epicenter of that January runoff election after our November 3rd elections, and where it was clear by that Saturday, November 7th, I wonder where you all were as that the declaration that Biden-Harris had in fact won this election, that of course a number of deniers emerged on one side of the partisan spectrum, and people began to sort of align around what will happen to the Senate once we discovered that neither of the Republican sitting U.S. senators had won their races decisively. Everyone realized what was at stake because the balance of power in the Senate would pivot on what happened in Georgia. So that primarily, Brenda, I think was what set us apart. Our laws, our election administration shared a lot in common with other states. And so that wouldn't have distinguished us as much as, I think, what happened in 2018, the emergence of Stacey Abrams as a compelling candidate for governor, and her important and challenging indictments of the then Secretary of State who became the governor of Georgia. So this, it's almost become Shakespearean in the way this is playing itself out, the complexities, the intrigues, and Stacey Abrams continuing to carry on this campaign of righteous enlistment of new voters and indignation over the way in which so many people were not allowed to vote or have their votes counted in 2018. And then, of course, in 2020, with the opportunity to win the Senate, that was a high stakes election. And the eyes of the nation and the world were on Georgia. And even today's title, I love Mesa Refuge for your thoughtfulness in terms of Georgia on my mind. And of course, it invokes that musical genius, Ray Charles, and his art piece and his song. But it also reminds us of this extraordinary history that has unfolded in this particular state, the birthplace and home of Martin Luther King Jr., the role that he and Coretta Scott King and so many leaders in Georgia played, from Joseph Lowery and C.T. Vivian to John Lewis and many, many others, in trying to tip the arc of the moral universe toward greater inclusivity and justice.
So are you thinking that Georgia could be indicating the birth of a new South beyond Georgia?
Well, I want to leave it to experts on voting patterns, and there are many out there, but I think that I'm impressed by the fact that Georgia was tilting from red to purple and now purple to blue. And the question is, what next? What becomes of the future, particularly in light of this complicated and mostly egregious and negative bill that was signed on March 25th by Governor Kemp here in Georgia. Its title is ironic in some ways offensive, the Election Integrity Act of 2021. And even in the language of this 98-page bill, why does a bill have to be 98? Why isn't this 5 pages long if you're really just trying to deal with a couple of problems of alleged voter fraud? But it is everyone who describes it, and this has bearing on your question in terms of future voting activity and patterns in Georgia. Will it remain and go deeper blue or back purple, red, what have you? It's going to be an interesting thing to watch the coming elections, certainly next year in 2022, when Senator Warnock is up for re-election and when the governor's race occurs. So it's just a fascinating time, and we shall see, what occurs next. But the language in that bill, characterized as sweeping, talked about, and I found this remarkable in reading the bill because it talked about in 2018 and 2020, there was significant lack of voter confidence. It doesn't say in the results, but rather in election administration. And so this bill, the Election Integrity Act of 2021, comes forth now for passage along strictly partisan lines, not a single Democratic voter, and yet the language attempted to frame it as a bipartisan effort and problem solver. For on one hand, it said, just on page 3 of the bill, it said, we're attempting to address allegations of rampant voter suppression and allegations of rampant voter fraud. And they put those together as if there were kind of equivalence and evidence and empirical support for both claims when there wasn't and isn't. And so the whole premise, as many wiser people than me have said, is fundamentally faulty, that there was rampant voter fraud. Even the Attorney General under Mr. Trump said there was not. The Secretary of State of Georgia said there was not rampant voter fraud. The governor of Georgia affirmed there was not. Brennan said all of these experts on voting and elections affirmed that to be the case. So I think Georgia becomes now an interesting test case. And as many of your viewers and our participants know today, 47 states have followed this pattern that Georgia has led in, introducing over 361 bills, I think Elaine alluded to, 361 being considered. 5 have already passed, including Georgia's Election Integrity Act of 2021. So it's going to be interesting, but I think we also need to be aware a lot of people are watching and weighing in, including the business community, the faith community, and the grassroots activists community.
So I want to get to the reaction of the business community, but I have to ask this question, and I'm pretty sure you don't have an answer to it. Why in the world did the Republicans think it was a good idea to make it illegal to give water and food to people standing in line to vote? Now, to me, it just seemed like somebody should say, hey, guys, that's just going too far.
I think you're absolutely right, Brenda. I mean, to even name that, to isolate this gesture of hospitality, just seemed like a microaggression, a kind of small meanness that sometimes affluent, smart people are capable of. And I think that it revealed itself in that little gesture of people who are standing in line, sometimes 4-6 hours. Back in June 2020, over 8 hours in some cases. People didn't bring food, or certainly enough food and water to last that long in a line. So Good Samaritans came along. Good citizens said, look, we're not trying to influence your vote. We're providing you with a snack and water. I was out there with others who sought, and this was not I wasn't on that particular ballot in November, simply to be a good citizen and to encourage. It was just moving to see people in those long lines. They brought picnic chairs. They were seated out there, this determination. And I could just see Fannie Lou Hamer. I could hear Ella Baker, all these activists who work so hard for people standing in line to vote. And now, unlike old Jim Crow, they wouldn't get to the front of the line and have to answer ridiculous questions or knowledge tests, or guess how many jelly beans were in a jar, or interpret a section of the Constitution. All they had to do, if they had registered to vote would stand there and vote. And people were there. And so I just think it's an unfortunate. I think the bill was certainly correct to mention no goods of value should be exchanged for influencing a vote. We all agree on that. Stacey Abrams, others have weighed in, but not to make it a misdemeanor to provide a bottle of water. And we know because they do allow election workers to provide that water. But as Stacey Abrams said, these people are so busy ministering the election, they don't have time to come out and administer or distribute refreshments to people. So it's just egregious that has occurred. But the bottom line for me, from what I saw in June, in the September 29th election to fill John Lewis's seat, which I know intimately about that election, and in subsequent elections, especially the most consequential, of course, November 3rd and then January 5th with the 2 Senate seats. The people are awake, people are educated, people are informed, and people are aroused and ready to vote. And they're not going to allow this act, flawed and complicated as it is, with all of its, whatever its unstated intent, but its clear impact to try to discourage and make it more difficult. I think people are going to vote as never before. And so we'll see what happens.
That's what I had a later question asking if you think that voter suppression efforts can backfire and actually galvanize and solidify these new voters to stay in the process.
I absolutely do. I think that that's a part of the energy of the November turnout following Stacey Abrams' experience in 2018, when she called out the inappropriate dismissal of certain votes, the exclusion of certain votes. People voted at right county but wrong precinct, and on as she kind of enumerated those efforts to suppress and exclude votes. And many believe that tens of thousands of votes as a consequence were not counted during that significant election. I think people are aware now that this can happen, will happen. I think they'll even take heart in knowing we have friends in California who are interested, who have Georgia on their mind, and throughout this nation, from Arizona to Oakland to Canada and parts beyond, that the world is watching, and this will backfire. I think that it has awakened the Kraken has been released and will turn out to make a difference.
And you were a signer on the April 14th We Stand for Democracy ad that was published in the New York Times and the Washington Post and other papers opposing voter suppression. Who organized the effort to bring all of those people together?
Ken Chenault, the former CEO of American Express, and Ken Frazier of Merck, Ursula Burns, former CEO of Xerox, were some of the leading voices and energies behind that effort. I also want to acknowledge and celebrate the important role of investment bankers in New York, with Bill Lewis, who was a friend and partner of Vernon Jordan, and of Dr. Michael Lomax of the United Negro College Fund, urging people to really pay attention to Georgia and to ensure that Georgia would be carefully monitored by the national community and the business community. I don't think anybody expected quite the outpouring that then emerged, because that group of 70 or 80 African-American CEOs and senior leaders and board members, corporate board members, weighed in earlier a couple of weeks back. And then, so this more recent letter that received endorsement from over 100 people and a lot of celebrities and law firms, Silicon Valley, on and on, which ultimately put pressure on MLB, the Major League Baseball, to say maybe it's not a good idea to indicate our support for a bill that was clearly conceived in the back room following the successful election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in November, and of the two Democratic senators in January. They began to tinker with measures that were not broken, throwing solutions at non-existent problems. And so one began to get a sense, okay, this is going to be interesting. What's in this bill? And, I think the New York Times called out 16 different measures, and perhaps the most egregious being that the Secretary of State elected by the people is no longer the chair of the state board of elections, but instead the General Assembly, the state legislature, selects that person. Now, it's supposed to be a nonpartisan, but it's interesting the way it opens the door for increased partisan tampering in our political process that was not broken. So I think those corporate leaders realized they could see the writing on the wall. And then the amazing optic of a governor who immediately after one party passed the bill, the election integrity of 2021 bill. An hour later, for the governor to gather with a handful of other Republican leaders, it happened that they were all white males, and standing outside the governor's door was a state senator, Park Cannon, happened to be an African-American woman, knocking on the door in protest, respectfully, gently, to say, I'd like to be present to witness this signing. I want to interrogate you, Governor, so that you know the ramifications and impacts. And for that optic to go out worldwide was extraordinary. And so I think it added a kind of, again, this sense of consequence, almost of Shakespearean consequence and drama to Georgia politics, and the way in which the national business community stepped up has been inspiring, remarkable. I hope they'll continue, but I also hope that we can find places where we can restore some measure of bipartisan, deeper listening, respect, and cooperation. Let's try to back out of some of the partisan standoff if we can. And I say that as one aspiring to be a moral leader in the spirit of Dr. King, trying to bring people together, saying we can fix this. But this bill and what it has set in motion is irredeemable, can be reformed. And of course, and I'll just end by saying there are two significant court challenges from the Georgia NAACP and the New Georgia Project that say very clearly this bill has a negative compound effect and a disproportionate effect on voters of color.
So in the House of Representatives for the People Act includes important and broad protections of voting, including limiting partisan gerrymandering, which I want to come back to gerrymandering. What are your thoughts about that bill?
So HR 1, the For the People Act, has been passed by the House of Representatives. It's very exciting because there are critical measures there that I think really try to speak to something we opened with at the top of this program, what the Supreme Court did in the Shelby County case. And essentially, as John Lewis put it, gutting the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In particular, this requirement of pre-clearance, as it's known, that states wish to modify the election administration, anything related to voter registration, absentee ballots, the counting of votes, et cetera, drawing of district lines, et cetera. All of that must be submitted in writing along with a racial impact report and demonstrate to the court satisfaction or Department of Justice satisfaction that there will be no negative impact, particularly on voters of color, since there's been this long history of explicit exclusion and suppression of Black votes. So that's why, the remedy, the repair, should be as specific and targeted as the initial offense. And when the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 that those measures could be removed, immediately, and many of you know this already, states, particularly throughout the former Confederacy, but indeed throughout the nation, began to take steps to limit the impact of voters of color, of new immigrants, and others who are arriving, and so it's going to be an interesting contested piece of legislation. The Senate Judiciary Committee had hearings this week. It was compelling to hear testimony from Senator Warnock, Stacey Abrams, Sherilyn Ifill of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and others. But ultimately, the effort is to restore and protect the Voting Rights Act, to reduce the role of money, big money, dark money in our elections, to hold elected officials to higher ethical standards, and essentially to try to restore, go back at least to a time when the Senate would vote along unanimous bipartisan lines to protect and extend the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And now we're in a very different place. And I think corporate America, I think the media, I think academics, I think attorneys, and just ordinary citizens throughout this nation really ought to be worried about this moment in our democracy's history.
And I guess, venture to say that probably most of us never thought we'd be back at this moment. We thought we had progressed past that.
Yeah, I think this really almost pivots, Brenda, to my other concern that this is a conversation about Georgia's election act. Now it's not an act, it is the law in Georgia. Obviously, there are going to be court challenges, but this is the law of the land, that all of these provisions that discourage, suppress vote, predicated on allegations of rampant voter fraud, which were non-existent. Why are we seeing this lack of trust, this intent, this insistence on grabbing and holding power? And how do we move beyond this? In the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville, many of us have read his classic Democracy in America. And he offered a quote that I use in my little book, Moral Leadership, that I think is listed, the link in the chat. But in that, I open with this quote that he says, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." And I think that's an interesting question. I would put it to our audience today. Do you believe America still has that ability that de Tocqueville highlighted to repair our faults through negotiation, through argument, through political agreement and conversation? That, I think, is hanging in the balance now, Brenda, and it'll be interesting to see how this, in the past, America, I think, moved forward, and part of what I argue in the book, there were significant leaders, moral leaders, people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, people like Ella Baker and John Lewis, people like Abraham Lincoln and Eleanor Roosevelt, who would move the needle, who would say, I'm setting a different tone in the nation. Let's learn to trust, to forgive, to work together, to find and puzzle out common ground for working people. Could this happen under Biden, Harris? I don't know. I hope so. I'm pulling for them. But I was also pulling for this in earlier administrations, including George Bush's administration. Disagreed with a lot, but if there was an effort to find common ground, I thought, let's make it happen. And as Jürgen Habermas, the German social critic, says, in a great argument, the force of the better argument will win. So I think that's where we are now, Brenda, is what will be the force, the better argument that wins out over the partisan bickering and the mendacity and dishonesty that now underwrites our politics.
And then I guess the role of the way that social media has been used for misinformation, so that the belief in the strength of the better argument, it almost seems, I don't know, I don't want to say irrelevant, but people are so misinformed.
Yes.
And so, in their separate, without any standard or agreement on what's, an argument at all.
No surprise that a brilliant journalist would introduce the notion of poorly informed citizens as a threat to the future of our democracy. I'll share this one quote. You'll love this because I know Elaine and others are going to be coming in. But the second president of the United States, John Adams, said, "Facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be your inclinations or wishes or the dictates of your passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence," end quote. And I think it's that claim, that insight, and the work that you and other journalists and media people are doing to help educate us and hold powers accountable. Back to Elie Wiesel, hold the powers accountable. That is so critical right now. And I don't know, this is such a changing landscape because with the Facebooks and the social media companies of the world have some different practices and standards, and sometimes holding them accountable is going to be a challenge as we puzzle out, well, what about the First Amendment? And how do we negotiate? How do we create guardrails, et cetera? So I'll leave that to smarter people than I am in terms of information, media, and how we educate the public, and especially our young people who are watching. And I think that's something we should all remember.
So you mentioned your campaign to fill John Lewis's, to complete his term. What were some of the, I guess, revelations of running for, that was your first time running for office? First
time running, an old guy inspired by an older guy, John Lewis, but felt that there was, I was present for the funeral that Friday, I guess it was, after he passed away, and basically had to make a quick decision because by Sunday, candidates had to declare. And I talked it through with my wife, Cheryl, and we ultimately decided this is something I wanted to do. When I learned that certain people who I thought might run, who I would support, were not running, that's what ultimately tipped my decision. And I would say the bottom line, just to wrap up this long answer, it was that you can influence the discourse, the state of the conversation. You can. And I felt, particularly because I talked about John Lewis as more than a transactional politician, but John Lewis as a public moralist, a public intellectual with bandages on his head because he was paying the price through sacrifice and struggle and protest, but also through negotiation as an elected official to work across the aisle for the good of our democracy. And I wanted to ensure that that spirit was kept alive. And what I found was I felt that I could add something to the conversation and keep alive that dimension of John Lewis as the public intellectual and as the consensus builder. And so the discourse did take note of claims about moral leadership. And I felt good about that. And that's my word of hope and encouragement to others of you who are out there now watching and listening to us. Your voice matters. and you can change the discourse. The force of the better argument can move history forward.
Well, I hope so. So I don't know.
Good.
Is it time to have questions from the audience?
Sure. Hi, this is Elaine Ellenson again. This has been just fascinating, but we do have some wonderful questions from the audience as well. So let me try to pose them and consolidate some of them as well. I think somebody said that, if voting wasn't so important, then they wouldn't try to suppress the vote. So can you address sometimes in history why people have realized how important the vote was and the campaigns for the vote that kind of are being echoed now?
Yeah, it's remarkable that this young republic, so many who populated this nation in the certainly by the time we were creating a republic, fighting for independence and a republic at the end of the 18th century, the best and brightest in the nation, some of whom had experienced monarchies throughout Europe and England, wanted to do something different here. And you all know this history, and they knew John Locke and Immanuel Kant and the philosophical arguments for respecting the dignity of every person, respecting autonomy, giving individual citizens voice and vote. And that informed an interesting ethos that led to a kind of confidence in the common person, the common man, as they talked about it so usually then, and the emergence of these remarkable documents that would define the contours of a new government. The Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution. I mean, just that, 56 words that talked about we the people in order to create, establish more perfect union and promote the general welfare. It's just amazing moral aspirational language. Made the vote really quite significant because it was a form of participation in something noble and ennobling. And of course, women were excluded. African Americans were excluded. And so it introduced from the beginning in American DNA a tension, a contradiction. I love the way W.B. Du Bois writes about this, as he writes in his classic book, Black Reconstruction, and the need for a group of people in the society who were not blinded by their own privilege. These men could vote, white male property owners. They didn't quite see that they were excluding and oppressing others. So women began to organize and mobilize. And African Americans began to organize and mobilize. And the emergence of these extraordinary voices for enfranchisement, from Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others as they moved through the great gathering in Seneca in 1848, and then handing off the baton to a 20th century group of activists. Finally, legislation passed, women able to vote. We're into the 20th century by then, but it did happen, constitutional amendment. And then later, the Voting Rights Act that ensured that African-American women could vote because there were African-American men voting before that passage of that 65 Voting Rights Act. Ultimately, it was the affirmation. I love the way Senator Raphael Warnock talks about it. My vote was a symbol of personal dignity and presence in the world. I had to be counted. And it's the notion that the common sense notion that we count votes. That's how we arrive at totals. We count votes. And the sense that I count, I matter, and I have to be reckoned with my rights as well as my responsibility. So is that responsive, Elaine?
Yeah, actually, there's a kind of a corollary question which you've just led right up to. from another attendee, which is, how does voting and the right to vote actually impact challenges to justice in other areas like systemic racism, homelessness, etc.? What is the relationship between voting and some of the other challenges to justice that we have?
Well, certainly when it comes to expressing policy preferences and policies that provide some of the nice things. I love the way Heather McGhee writes about why can't Americans have nice things in her incredible book, The Sum of Us, which is also written at Mesa Refuge. So she's my sister in arms in pen as we were there trying to work out our thoughts. But like universal health care, that people will be cared for. They don't have to worry to death that the sickness, the illness of a parent or a child or oneself will suddenly devastates your whole life you've worked for. That ought not to be a threat to an American citizen. Or the presence of a reliable infrastructure, or the presence of a trustworthy jury to sit in cases and hear difficult cases, including the consequential and historic police case we heard. In fact, we were in conversation that very day. I'll just observe that as a moment the three of us shared as this verdict was just issued in the Derek Chauvin trial. So, I mean, all of these have an impact to the questioner's important point about these other sort of non-political, if you will, impacts of voting and voter participation, our health, our infrastructure, our criminal justice system, our education system, on and on. And I think we ought to take more seriously this whole category of political goods. The right to vote, but also the right to run for office, to participate very directly, the right to govern, and to have a voice in what's happening. And of course, the big threat now is the so-called dark money. And one of the things that HR 1, that this For the People Act, that I think is so important, is that it insists on greater transparency in the sources of political contributions and funding. You know, we thought we had handled this before, but we sort of ebb and flow on this. And now there are millions and millions of dollars pouring into elections. And some are angry that Silicon Valley billionaires are pouring money into influence, and some are concerned about, Koch brother, Walton, and some of these other sources. So we need to have that conversation. How are we going to regulate and control the role of money in politics?
Thank you. I mean, you've really illustrated so clearly how pivotal the right to vote is. And I think, maybe a decade ago, a lot of young people didn't really see that. And now, as you're pointing out, even this election in Georgia and, the attempt to suppress the vote is now bringing out the importance of that to so many, many more people, which is really, really great. There's a question for Brenda, which is, there's been an effort to get Home Depot, which has a lot of stores in the Bay Area, to sign on to the letter that you referenced earlier about supporting the right to vote and going against voter suppression that a lot of corporations joined. The participant would like to know if you would be interested in writing an article about Home Depot.
Yeah, maybe. I don't really have a venue right now, but it's a good idea. I think I saw something where the Home Depot guy did he partially condemn some of the efforts, the suppression efforts? I'm not so sure. But yeah, I'll think about it.
Okay, good.
I'm retired though, so.
I see. Robert.
Sorry. this is not the format we planned, but I forgot to ask an important question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, because when I was asking people for what questions they would like to pose, it kept coming up that people were like, what can be done to stop all of these voter suppression laws? And what can people, not lawyers, but what can we do across the country?
Actually, that's a question that came out in our chat too. So several people have asked that. So thank you for proposing it.
Well, I think that ensuring that we support our most courageous and most effective organizations and leaders who are on the front line is in some ways the low-hanging fruit, the something that you can do from your mobile device or computer in terms of contributions to these organizations, and monitoring, reading, becoming informed, as Brenda talked about it earlier. I think those are really kind of basic entry-level ways of supporting the effort. I think this is really going to heat up next year, 2022, as we prepare for those important elections. Those of us in Georgia, we're going to need your help. But throughout the nation, there will be, as you know, important elections determining the future composition of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So we need to help each other. And I want to support organizations in the Bay Area that are doing this important work. We need to expand the focus as well and raise questions in your social media. One of our dear colleagues and public intellectuals on our call today, Paula Gordon, just called attention to the fact and reminded it, we all know that this is Earth Day and the need to prioritize climate justice and environmental issues, something that she and her husband, Bill Russell, have done so powerfully over the years. So here in Georgia and throughout the nation. So those are, ways of expanding the agenda and ensuring that that what Stacey Abrams is doing, what the Fair Fight organization, you Google that, you can find of where you can supporting the efforts of certainly Raphael Warnock next year. I think those are going to be the most decisive. And then figuring out at your local level how you can have an impact, how you can hold elected officials accountable, and how you can mobilize people so that they do feel encouraged or angry and agitated enough to get involved and to vote.
Well, we're about to wind up, but I just wanted to ask you both for any final thoughts about some of the questions that have been raised, or especially the question that you were just addressing, Robert, about how people can get involved.
Yeah. I'll go first, Brenda. I'll just simply say that, again, my book on moral leadership, I conclude with the little chapter, few pages long, that asks the question, can we repair? And I think the state of our current crisis is we are a deeply divided, polarized nation. We don't even know how to talk to each other. The struggle for the MSNBC crowd to talk to the Fox TV crowd. Although there are moments where I was just thinking about the fact that during that critical 4-day period from the election of November 3rd until that Saturday, November 7th, when, most authorities and where the election was essentially certified for Biden, the Electoral College, of course, the vote and turnout, all that was the part of the drama of January 6th. But when it was clear that they had won those critical states, it was important for people to be able to trust and to believe in the information. And so I think that a time of education and being well informed now is critical, and the need for moral leadership that helps us walk toward repair, someone in the chat noted, we still do have that capacity as Americans to repair. I call attention to some examples where it's happening. Aspen Institute bringing people together from the red-blue divide. People are doing this. My friend Eric Liu in the Bay Area, all over the country, all of you probably have your examples of struggling to bring divided parties together. And I think some of this is going to involve a reading agenda. Hence, thank God for Mesa Refuge and why we should all support Mesa Refuge, because it creates space for thought leaders to come together and weigh in and have an impact. And in my own modest way, both writing the book that Mesa Refuge, who I credit at the beginning, but also running for office and having a larger voice in the public square. And to be there with two remarkable thought leaders who helped my thinking in the persons of Dahlia Lithwick, a brilliant Supreme Court reporter and interpreter, as well as Ramon Castelbach, writing about health policy in California and in the nation. So bottom line, we need information. We need moral leadership. We need people who are willing to risk bringing people together and finding common ground.
Thank you. Brenda, did you want to add something to that as well?
I just want to say that actually this conversation has been really inspiring for me because I guess Robert's clarity, aside from academics and intelligence and brilliance, but the clarity and focus on moral leadership is very heartening to me. And I think, and the idea that the discourse can be affected and, pivoted and toward more thoughtfulness and commitment to, some larger good is very encouraging. And I almost feel like naive saying it, or I don't know. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that warms my heart. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. Yes, I actually feel so much more encouraged than I have in a long time just listening to you both. So very special thanks to Robert Franklin and Brenda Payton Jones for this really inspiring discussion. I also want to thank our program director, Kamala Tully, for flawlessly staging our discussion on Zoom today, and to Kira Epstein for getting the word out, and especially to Mesa Refuge Executive Director, Susan Tillett, for organizing our From the Gathering Room series, which brings inspiring talks like this to all of us. If you'd like to see some earlier sessions, there are some on YouTube under Mesa Refuge channel. So you can, and this one will be edited and aired as well. As I mentioned earlier, this event today is part of our Spring Changemakers campaign. And to learn about this campaign and to support inspiring writers and activists like Robert Franklin and Brenda Payton Jones and all the people that Robert mentioned that he was there with, please go to mesarefuge.org. I think we'll put it up in the chat there, and you can click donate. There you can learn about our other change makers as well, and your support makes it possible for us to provide time and space for writers like our change makers and our wonderful alums to work and without any expense to themselves. Those who are not from Mesa Refuge, I hope you will visit our site, mesarefuge.org, and after the pandemic, hopefully to visit us in person in Point Reyes. In the meantime, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. A special thanks to Robert and to Brenda. This was just an inspiring day for us. To everyone, please stay safe and well. And inspired by Robert and Brenda, please continue the fight for voting rights. And with that, I thank you all from Mesa Refuge.